Okay, all right. Welcome everyone to another installment of the online peace science colloquium. Today I'm standing in for Emily Ritter. My name is Brad Smith. I'm an assistant professor here at Vanderbilt University, and we're very excited to be hosting Nadiya Kostyuk, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan. She's going to be presenting a paper entitled, "Can States Make Cyber Deterrence Work?" We have a great panel of discussants today. First, we have Tiberiu Dragu, who is an associate professor at New York University. We have, well, it looks like we may have lost Andres, but we have Andres Gannon, who is a PhD candidate at the University of California, San Diego. And we also have Aaron Brantly, who is an assistant professor at Virginia Tech. Okay, so I think everyone knows the format. We'll have a 15-20 minute presentation by Nadiya, and then we'll use the remaining time for questions and discussion. So with that, I think I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Nadiya. Go ahead and get started with the presentation.
Great, thank you so much for having me and for allowing me to share my work. Let me start with sharing my screen. Great. Okay, can you see it?
Yes, looks great.
Great, okay. So today I'm going to discuss this project, which was originally titled, "Can States Make Cyber Deterrence Work?" Or a more nuanced title would be "Cyber Institutions, Suboptimal Logic of Cyber Deterrence," which basically talks about the same idea: can state make cyber deterrence work? So the motivating puzzle for this project was the rhetoric that existed in academia and the policy that cyber deterrence is difficult and a lot of times is impossible because of the difficulty of attributing the origin of cyber attacks. And so as a result, the literature talks about different other types of deterrence, such as deterrence by normative taboos and deterrence by entanglement. And each of these types of deterrence has its own, I would say, challenges when it comes to cyberspace. And so what was interesting for me is that during the last few years, states started talking about this new way of potential way of deterring their adversaries. And particularly what they've been doing, they've been creating cyber institutions. This is not a very perfect term to describe what I mean, but hopefully it gets to the idea what I'm trying to explain here. By cyber institutions, I'm talking about publicly observable efforts aimed to signal countries' level of offensive capability, doctrine behind its use, and clarify the actions and types of actions that are going to lead to specific responses. Of course, when we think about cyber institutions or institutional changes, as I refer to them in my paper, we can think about, anything coming from like educations related to cyber, institution related to cyber crime, or related to economic damage. But here I'm talking about specific type of cyber institutions. And to give you a few examples, what I mean here is military institutions or military units. By creating an army or command or unit, the country is very upfront by saying, we're gonna have the capability and we're gonna use the capability to punish the perpetrator. A lot of time with the creation of specific unit, we observe also doctrinal changes. Most of the times they are offensive or imply cyber offense. So again, the countries are saying that we're gonna use the capability to go after those that are gonna attack us. And a lot of times these changes are complemented with the increase in budget and the personnel. And so, of course, in this paper, and I guess I realized I wasn't very good at explaining that it's not necessarily, I mean that by increasing cyber budget, all of a sudden the country is able just to deter the adversary. But it's more about the cumulative effort and the cumulative change that is that has an effect. And as a result, because of this cumulative effort, I am measuring my institutional changes in the game that I'm going to present a little later as a continuous variable. I'm not looking only at the binary effect. For instance, if the country will publish new white paper and says we're going to have an offensive posture, all of a sudden it's going to have an effect. It's all about the cumulative effort that aim to signal the capability to execute the change and willingness to do so. So just to give you a few examples of the cyber institutions that are kind of described here is Russia plans to devote between 200 million and 250 million US dollars per year to create a cyber deterrent effect that they hope will have play a similar role to the nuclear weapon, to nuclear deterrent. Similarly, we see Germany and Japan, they're also creating their units within their militaries, and despite their specific constitutions, they are trying to take more offensive posture. To completely change it to offensive posture, they would need to change the constitutions, which is, of course, difficult. So we see that the countries have been moving in the direction. France recently, actually this January, implemented its first doctrine for offensive cyber operations. And again, it's very upfront, I would say, one of the few nations that actually is very clear about its willingness to use the cyber capability to respond. And so, of course, the questions comes to this, whether these actions can deter the attacks. And the reason, again, I would like to iterate once again that I'm looking at the question is not, is because all these changes are often, they're complemented with the actual rhetoric. So if you look at the documents, or if you look at the reasoning why these changes are being done, the government official, the governments, they talk about deterring adversaries and reassuring alliances. So this rhetoric of deterrence keeps coming all the time. And so here I'm talking about whether this deterrence can work. And the reason I'm focusing on the high-level attacks is because it's very difficult to deter anything in cyberspace. And the main reason is we cannot speak about absolute deterrence because a lot of cyber espionage is going, and again, if a country creates a cyber command, it's not going to necessarily respond to any small level noise. And so by high level attacks, I mean here strategic operations. And again, I'm taking this language from the various documents that talk about deterrence, and they say we are doing this to deter strategic or detrimental attacks against us. And so in the game that I'm going to demonstrate a little bit later, I'm demonstrating that there are some situations when cyber institutions, they can deter. And the main reason is because they can make an adversary to overestimate the existing cyber capability. And so maybe this effect of deterrence may be short term, very little, but still I'm saying it's possible. There might be some conditions under which they can deter. And also, I will show some regions in my model when cyber institutions have no effect on adversarial decision. In those situations, I'm arguing that domestic politics or various other factors such as budgetary, legal constraint, organizational structure can play an effect. And we should pay attention to these other factors as well. Okay, just briefly, I have a lot of actually words on this slide, I realize, but I would say the major contribution of this work is that in general, lots of cyber literature talks about cross-domain deterrence or deterrence by using cyber operations. And in that case, when we have deterrence by using cyber operations, the major challenge is that we have an attribution or false flags operation. So basically, we know that the signal has been sent, but we don't know with complete, 100% certainty that who sent the signal. In my game, I'm actually flipping this around and I'm saying we know who the sender of the signal is because the country builds the capability, the cyber institution, and it's very clear. So we know 100% who is sending the signal of deterrence, but we don't know how precise the signal is because it's very difficult to check the level of existing capability. And so I would say this is how my work is kind of adds up to this huge literature on cyber deterrence in this regard. So for deterrence to work, the signal has to be credible. Basically, cyber institution has to signal credibility. And as I mentioned in my introduction, is because a lot of documents, they tend to establish this link between action and response. I would argue that cyber institution send this credible signal. So for instance, again, take in France, the recent documents mentions that the country is ready to aggressively defend against and respond large-scale attacks. We know that Russia has been very active in this regard, starting with 2000, and has been talking about information operations and deterring them, even by using military capabilities. And U.S., Australia, UK also has been changing their stand and has been talking about using offensive capability to respond to attacks. And also, I argue the cyber institutions, the signal capability. So again, a lot of times countries, they provide their budget of personnel they plan to devote to cyber institutions, even though, let's say, it's not always the case, and a lot of information is secret because it's a question of national security. We still can have some sort of estimate of, how big this this move is, how big this change is, how kind of estimate the capability by even if a budget is not necessarily provided. Here again, some sort of examples of these efforts. And so, of course, the criticism might be is that transparency of cyber institutions is tend to be a feature of democratic institutions. Well, it's generally true. I would say it's not always the case, as we've seen the example of Russia that is very clearly providing some information. Of course, the biggest challenge is we don't know what is being in the open sources, because obviously I base my work on open sources and some interviews and intelligence reports that again are being provided in open sources. In general, it's difficult to verify what is the level of this capability that is being presented. And so what I'm arguing is that because of this difficulty to verify, it might be easy to misrepresent. And because of this, some nations that don't have the strong cyber capabilities, they might use it in order to get some benefit, in order to be able to deter their adversaries from attacking them. And so how do adversarial nations perceive these cyber institutions? In general, like during the last few years when countries started making changes to their doctrine and posture, they started naming specific adversarial actors that they're trying to deter, right? We tend to hear all the times about China, Iran, Russia, North Korea. But even before, like a few years ago, when they were creating these changes, they were not using specific names in their documents. But despite that, countries tend to, adversarial nations tend to perceive this transparency effort as an effort to deter. So for instance, Adam Siegel writes about how China perceives the US transparency. And he mentioned that China actually takes all these efforts, US transparency efforts, to be directed at them and as an effort to deter China from attacking the US. Similarly, because of these transparency effort, they can perceive cyber institutions as a demonstration of increased military capability, and as a result, they can perceive this as a change of balance. So basically, the gap between two countries in terms of the national military capabilities can be decreasing, and as a result, this can have a deterrent effect. Okay, so here I decided to go ahead with the model, and unlike I decided to take a little maybe unusual approach in describing my model, because it's I realized that this talk is very abstract and sometimes it's hard to follow because I don't have very specific examples. I decided to draw a cartoon, so hopefully it's going to be easy to follow and to understand what I'm trying to do with this model. And so here we have country A, and country A is trying to deter country B. Basically, it's adversary. And so in real situation, there are a lot of adversarial actors, and they all differ by their capability to attack country A. And so, of course, in the ideal world, when the country creates cyber institution, this institutional change will have an effect on all adversarial nations. But to simplify, in my model, what I'm arguing is that, in general, country A would tailor its efforts to deter the strongest adversary, and if it's able to deter the strongest adversary, then it's able to deter all the rest of them. And so, because of that, I'm assuming a dyadic nature of this game, and because of that, I'm assuming that the attribution is not an issue here. Okay, so here's the deterrence is successful. And so how can A deter country B? In order to do it, it has to have some sort of cyber capability, right? Because it says that, you know, if you're going to attack me, I'm going to attack you back. And one thing that I'd like to mention, of course, this game doesn't take into account the cross-domain deterrence, but a lot of the times, when you have a very significant cyber capability, you might have also significant, you know, capabilities in other domain. But so, in order for A to create cyber capabilities, it can have it has limited resources as any government, and so A decides how it wants to distribute these limited resources. And there are two options that I'm considering. The first one. Again, it's just a simplification of these various programs that the government can invest its resources to create the capability. One is to create cyber institutions, and another one is to implement, to create, I guess, non-cyber institutions. By cyber institutions, as I mentioned, is these publicly observable changes that meant to deter an adversary, and all these other efforts that are not cyber institution, it would be something that is not as easily observable, but is very important as well. For instance, creating the operational and tactical capability, working, for instance, let's say with contractors or third parties. So these efforts do not necessarily require institutional changes, and they're not as easily observable to the public, but they're still important for the cumulative cyber capability of any given nation. And so depending how the country decides to distribute its resources, it can have different effects on an adversary and success of its deterrence. So if it decides to invest most of its resources into these publicly observable changes, I argue that this can create this kind of facade of cyber capabilities that is not actually existing, and it can increase A's chances in deterring B. But because of that, it will take valuable resources from the non-cyber institution, and as a result, it will decrease the cyber capability in general. Other scenario is that when it distributes its resources into both of these sources of cyber capability, and of course, overall cyber capability of the country will increase, but we don't know if it's going to have a change for, if it's going to have increased chances of successfully deterring B. And so, for the purpose of the model, I'm distinguishing two types of country. One is
Nadiya, I think we've got about 5 more minutes for presentation.
Yes, I'm almost done. Thank you. I'm distinguishing two types of country. One is weak and one is strong. And weak is the one I'm distinguishing them by the level of existing cyber capabilities, because before the country implements institutional change. And I'm saying that they will differ on the level of cyber institutions they create, and also on the success of deterrence. And so here, how the game proceeds. Nature chooses the type, then the type chooses how it wants to distribute its resources and how much it wants to invest in cyber institutions. And B observes this institutional change. Potentially, B can update his beliefs about A's type, and then B decides whether he wants to attack A or not. And of course, when B makes his decision, he considers the possibility of retaliation and the size of retaliation coming from A. And then we have the outcome of the game. And so here I present the results. So this line demonstrates the P bar, B's willingness to attack. And along this line, we have two other important cutoff points. We have PW and PS. Both of which demonstrate the probability of successfully retaliating against B, which could be a proxy of successful deterrence. And the assumption here is that PS is larger than PW, but where PW and PS place on this line, P bar, it doesn't have any specific effect. So let's look at 3 different regions and see the relationship between P bar, PW, and PS. So the first one, all the way to the left, is P bar is less than both P's. What it means here is that P bar has basically is not willing to attack A. So basically, it doesn't matter what A is doing. B already made up his mind not to attack A. So here it may give a wrong impression that deterrence works, but in fact, institutions has no effect whatsoever. So let's think about the other factors that can play a role. For instance, a country is going through, let's say China is going through the leadership transition, and the Philippines create cyber institutions to deter China. And China doesn't attack the Philippines, and the assumption here is like, oh, deterrence worked. But in fact, it has no role because other, basically outside option was more important for B at that time. Similarly, we have the opposite scenarios all the way to the left, to the right. And what means here is that B already made up his mind to attack country A, and it doesn't matter what A is doing, B is going to attack. And here the impression is, maybe there's challenge with the signal has been sent, or there are other factors that affects this situation. But basically, it might give an impression that deterrence fails. But in this situation, institutional change has no effect. And these 2 regions are very important, especially when we start testing this idea and trying to make estimates, because by including this region where institutional change has no effect, we may conclude wrongly that deterrence worked or didn't work. Where deterrence matter is in the middle region. And here there are 2 scenarios. The first one is that in this middle region, weak type knows that B will try to attack the weak type, but avoid attacking the strong type. And so as a result, weak type will try to imitate the strong type and overinvest all these resources in the publicly observable changes. And if the result might be successful, it can avoid, deterrence might work. The second scenario is when, a continuation of this scenario is because strong types knows that there are so many weak types that are trying to imitate strong types. It will try to strategically separate itself from these weak types that are trying to imitate. And as a result, it would invest additional resources in its publicly observable institutional changes to make sure that only very few of the weak types try to imitate him. And so we can see here that in this region, there is a competition between the types of A themselves. And in fact, both types that are not necessarily creating the cyber capability, basically implementing changes to increase the existing cyber capability, but they are taking these suboptimal decisions to create this facade of the capability that might not necessarily be there to be able to deter their adversaries. And I think because I'm out of time, I'll just sum it up that I demonstrated scenarios where deterrence might work. And in my paper, I provided some of the my interviews and intelligence report that I use to provide some evidence to support this theory development that I decided to try to achieve in this paper. So thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to the comments.
Great. Thanks, Nadiya. Great presentation. So I guess we'll turn it over now to the panelists. So I don't know who would like to start, but turn it over to the discussants.
I can.
Okay.
I can start. Hi everyone. I have some more basic questions in terms of sort of defining the terrain of analysis. So I was wondering, what is distinctive about cyber deterrence relative to traditional deterrence? So is it sort of the same logic as we understand in the case of, say, traditional armed deterrence or traditional conflict? Is it something qualitatively different about cyber? So do we get some novel theoretical prediction about deterrence in this area as opposed to what we know about deterrence in the context of, say, the Cold War or traditional conflict, or is sort of like the same logic applying in a different context? Is this, and more generally, is there something specific about cyber deterrence that we don't observe in the traditional deterrence theory that should give us some sort of a different kind of theoretical and empirical prediction? Is it maybe the fact that some of the actions are, not observable or less observable than the others? And that would, so I'm just wondering, like more of this conceptual sort of distinction and clarification before you jumping. So what? I'm just curious.
Should I answer or?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, of course. So the idea, you're right, that in general, when you have existing military capabilities, you still have uncertainty about the level and the actual capability behind this. But I argue, and I didn't do a good job in the paper, I was arguing the way I see it is that the uncertainty that exists about cyber capability is much higher than the uncertainty that exists over the military capability.
Can I just follow up shortly? So
Sure.
Think about a specific example, say Saddam Hussein, Iran versus Iraq, and Saddam wanted to cultivate this idea that Iraq has nuclear weapons. So you can think that, and there are arguments saying that the reason was trying to deter Iran, or at least make Iran think that they have high enough capabilities in case they would end up in a conflict. So it's in a way, right? I mean, they try to cultivate this uncertainty also in the context of traditional conflict, right? About whatever capability they might have. So how is this different than cyber? Or it need not be different. It might just be sort of the same logic applied in a different,
I would say that, okay. I would say the same logic applies. It's just the level of uncertainty is different. Maybe it's not good enough. I don't know. I was thinking, the example I was thinking also not only Iran, Iraq, but also during the Cold War, U.S. building the, what is it, the, not the units, but the places for the nuclear weapon, right? And the U.S. was deterred for some time by that, because it was hard to verify what is actually there and whether it's an empty place or whether, yeah. So I think it's the same in that regard. So you think I should include this, basically add more discussion on the literature, traditional deterrence literature, and explain how this logic is the same?
Yes, or maybe different, and then maybe say something a little bit about why, why is distinctive about your theory relative to the traditional deterrence theory. because a similar sort of theory can work and has been done in the context of traditional deterrence, where we think a country wanted to signal if they're weak, they try to signal that they're stronger than they are, and you can see examples where they're marching their armies. They want to put up a show to signal to the outside world that they are determined or resolved, or they have the capabilities to pick up a fight. Again, Saddam has done this a lot of times, but not just Saddam. This is North Korea, so forth. So you can think of a similar logic there, right? Where there's a sort of a game where there's some uncertainty about the type of the countries that they're interacting, could be weak or strong, and the weak try to signal they are strong, and then think about the conditions under which deterrence might work by using sort of strategies of pulling for the weak to pull with a strong, to look like a strong type, and so yeah, but. Yeah,
so if it's so I feel like if the logic is the same, the only thing what I'm arguing is that the level of uncertainty is a little bit different, because again, you cannot march with the army, and the challenge with the cyber capability is that cyber operations, I mean, nature is more dynamic, and there are all these things why cyber is different. So basically, it's kind of like scale is different. The logic is the same. Do you think there's still value in this game, or do you?
Oh no, I do. I think it would be helpful to. I think it's very interesting and very helpful to think about what is novel here, and just drawing these distinctions.
Because I had. Right. So I had the discussion of the cyber versus the traditional military stuff, and I had basically the comment that I received is that the model, and it is my first time like writing a game model paper, so it's very different. And so I received the comment from the people like you that models should not appear later than on page 10, and it's very hard for me to squeeze everything. And so I do have this distinction between cyber and traditional military operation in the online appendix, where I did not share. But I feel like if I start including that and explain what I mean by cyber institutions and which of them can deter, it basically becomes like a mess, So what do you think I should, how can I frame it in 5 pages? That's, I guess, my advice to you. I mean, the question.
Yeah, I really don't know, but I think, I would focus on what you think is the most important or the novel distinctions between cyber and traditional deterrence, right? Just draw the distinctions and say, here, it's sort of like a similar logic might be at work. However, there is a very important qualitative distinctions, whatever that might be. Maybe it's, a question of the degree of uncertainty is different, or the scale and so forth. And then say, okay, what that difference is going to give us in terms of novel theoretical and empirical prediction. And then the model should be structured just around that difference, where you say, okay, well, this is kind of like, will be a similar model as in, the classical deterrence theory, but however, here is a parameter, right? And you think, okay, whether you want to say, okay, there's a threshold level in terms of uncertainty that is, where it's, much higher here than where it's above the threshold level in your case, and not in the traditional deterrence, or whatever that parameter might be, and then solve the equivalent of that model and show, okay, well, this is then we get a distinctive prediction, and then what will be the observable implication of that prediction? What will be the conceptual distinctions related to traditional deterrence theory? So I would just focus the paper on, what is novel about cyber, right? Because it's basically the same. It will be more or less the same logic, and qualitatively get the same prediction, even if it might be a question of magnitude, no? So if you say, if I do comparative statistical uncertainty, and I get the same sort of qualitative prediction I would get, say, in a traditional deterrence theory model, then that would maybe not require, that much elaboration. But however, if you think there is an important conceptual distinction, and you get different predictions by focusing on the parameter, that would be very important. I just don't know where it is. I'm just more of a question, more of a sort of a suggestion how to frame it, how to think about presenting this domain. And also just a small note, when you think about uncertainty in the context of the traditional deterrence theory, I mean, yes, it's true. One could be uncertainty about the capabilities, but another one is uncertainty about the resolve. The type could be broadly defined. And that could be quite a lot of uncertainty of, say, the North Korea. How crazy is the leader that will push the nuclear button? It's a different kind of uncertainty, and maybe very high. And there could be different kind of uncertainties, right? Not just purely about military capabilities, which true, they're more observable, but it could just be really about behavioral uncertainty, about the type of the leader, right? Once they have a nuclear weapon, are they crazy enough to push it? And then again, then if you think about degrees of uncertainty, that could be, that might be quite high. That might depend on different factors, more personality, behavioral features of the leaders and so forth.
Okay.
I mean, that's just some suggestions to start with.
I think Aaron had some follow-up thoughts.
Yeah, so let me just follow up on here. If you're looking at this uncertainty versus uncertainty, if you think about it in terms of conventional conflict or something along those lines, in a weak state, create, say, a new infantry command or something along those lines. Well, there's still going to be a weak state. And so it doesn't really influence the knowledge of, even if we don't know exactly what type of weapons they use or something like that, it doesn't influence the model. So what I think, whether somebody's going to attack or not shouldn't be the primary goal. The goal should be to predict what the influence of institutional creation is on signaling out, if that makes sense. So does it just because a weak state creates an institution, whether it's in conventional kinetic or in cyber, is not the value. Is the institution something that provides a level of knowledge about potential capabilities moving forward? And in cyberspace, as opposed to kinetic space, it indicates a level of potential organizational capability that is required for software development that is fundamentally different than kinetic capability. And so it essentially increases the amount of information in the signal out. So if a weak state creates an infantry command, they're unable to signal out that they have the requisite weapons and other types of things to go along with that infantry command or an armor division or something along those lines. But in a cyber command, if I'm developing the organizational infrastructure that allows me to include software development teams, include in defense and cyber protection teams or other types of things.
Can you repeat the last thing with cyber command, because I couldn't
so I'm creating a cyber command. I'm creating an organization.
I don't hear one thing. I don't hear anything from Aaron. I can't hear you.
Oh no.
You can't hear.
I mean, I just...
No, like Tiberiu cannot hear you for some reason.
I didn't. Don't worry, no worries. I mean, there's no reason to waste time, but I'm just saying, I cannot do it when I don't...
So if Brad, if you unplug yourself, you will, I guess it will be hard for us to hear, actually. Yeah, sorry. Anyways.
No,
Aaron, yeah, can you please continue? Cyber command example?
So when you create a cyber command, what you're doing is you're creating the organization that allows for software development and for defensive capabilities to be developed. Because it's the organization itself that allows for the development of the capability, which is the requisite signal. Now, whether that organizational capability is backed up by quality members of that organization is the uncertainty associated with developing this institution. But a one-off hacker or a one-off cyber person in a military can't achieve substantial effects. Just like a one-off person developing a large-scale software platform can't achieve, it takes a long time to develop software or something along those lines. So it's the organizational capacity itself that serves as the signal for the ability to deter, if that makes sense. Does that make, so it's not, it's now that's the key here, is that's what distinguishes it from a conventional type of deterrence. Because whereas in one you're buying or leveraging existing weapon systems, here it's the actual ability to use people in tandem to develop malware, to develop hunt teams within a network that is the organizational capacity that provides the deterrent mechanism.
Okay. I think that's what I was trying to say. You just summarized really nicely. Yeah, I agree that organizational capacity versus, yeah, with the traditional deterrence, organizational capacity is not going to be having the same deterrent effect as it is here. That's true, because you need to, I'm sorry, I'm like, because you need to buy, right, because you need to, you not necessarily need to have organization itself, you need to have actually weapons and stuff that you actually need to buy, and then you just play that. Okay, yes, that's what I was trying to argue. So basically, Tiberiu, just to sum it up quickly, so Aaron was saying that by creating this organizational capacity for cyber, you are signaling, creating an organization, you signal this capacity, because by hiring people, you automatically show that they are going to be working on creating software and stuff, right? When you create the actual, let's say, organization in traditional sense, you still have to have equipment and planes and tanks, and people are not enough. So in this way, it's a little bit different, I would say. Aaron, do you have anything else?
Yeah, I think that by
great. I like it.
Yeah, so I think that by removing attribution and other things, it's also a challenge as well. And I think in my notes to you on a previous version of the paper, I indicated that you can get to a lot of the uncertainty by understanding the environment in which the institution is being developed. So you can create proxy measures to understand where the uncertainty is coming from. So if they have endogenous educational capabilities, infrastructure capabilities resident within a country, and other types of capabilities associated with those. And then I think the other aspect that kind of gets, the dyadic aspect is very important for your model, but the reality for a lot of the institutional development, and I think that you and I have both experienced this after going to NATO, is that a lot of the countries that are developing these institutions are developing them in response to requirements from NATO and others to create these signals. So they may not necessarily want to create cyber commands for deterrent purposes, but they're creating them for accumulated deterrence within an institution, within a macro institutional structure of NATO, if that makes sense. So, the Germans aren't necessarily developing cyber command for the purpose of developing German cyber command. They're developing it because at a NATO meeting, they decided that all European members of all the NATO members would develop these types of commands so that they could provide resources into another structure. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you. Yeah.
So, so I think we'll have, I think Andres had some comments next, some follow-up thoughts. So,
yeah. So I'll sort of give my thoughts just top to bottom now. Thanks, Nadiya, for the neat presentation and paper. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Nadiya?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll go from there. If you can hear me, then it's a start. So the sort of main argument here is about cyber institutions, which are unobservable for offensive cyber capabilities, are things that increase the credibility of cyber deterrence in some cases, but not others. And we know this investment happens in sort of the larger puzzle. What I find sort of exciting about this paper and project is thinking about the strategic logic of cyber deterrence. A lot of the writing and research so far seems to be about the implications of cyber and identifying cyber attacks do or should happen. But you sort of have a different focus, which is on how it happens and how one state's cyber activity strategically interacts with another state's cyber capability. I think that's sort of neat and useful. The model from as feedback from a non-modelist is clean, makes sense to me. It was sort of easy to follow and interpret. The interviews and empirics I thought were good and useful. Some suggestions for things that could be improved. I was thinking of sort of ways of framing the puzzle or different. It seems that paper is getting the ability to conduct cyber attacks themselves. Does that work? And why does this happen? Seems to be something that the model is getting at.
Andres, can you please repeat yourself, and also maybe you can turn off your camera because you're very fuzzy and you're kind of breaking up.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, camera off.
Yeah, that's much better.
Okay. Home internet, you know. So another way of reframing the puzzle or thinking about the puzzle is states try to deter cyber attacks by demonstrating that they have the to conduct cyber attacks themselves. Does that work? And why does that happen? Seems to be something that the kind of model is getting at, or a way about it that has a sort of larger tit for tat deterrence logic that we were talking about a little bit earlier. Or why do countries, I was sort of thinking about the questions I was left with after reading through the model, which is, why do states invest in these cyber institutions as a means of a deterrence capacity?
Andres, could you maybe repeat that last couple sentences that you said? That you were breaking up a little bit.
Is, why do states invest in cyber institutions as a way of signaling deterrence capacity if the fact that everyone does the same thing renders that signal moot? And that you sort of conclude or get it. I think that that's a thing that you can sort of start with, or a way of thinking about the puzzle at the top is everyone's going to do this thing, which defeats the purpose of doing the thing. So why do it? You briefly mentioned in the presentation the sort of cross-domain angle, and you sort of know my thoughts or my training on that. But things that I was thinking through that part is, in theory, you can deter an enemy's cyber attacks with cyber capacity. You can say like, hey, I have ICBMs, or I can invest more in tanks. And so I think the clarification of that is just, if you're sort of saying just I'll just assume the cyber relationship, then I think that that's okay to sort of you relax that assumption a little bit. Would be interesting. I was sort of wondering if an enemy is going to conduct cyber.
Well, Andres, are you there? We're having a few technical difficulties. Okay, so just to maybe, since we're having a little trouble with the connection here, I'll maybe sum up the points that Andres made to make sure everybody's on the same page, and then Nadiya, if you'd like to respond. So I think the first point, as I understood it, was sort of, if all of these states are doing something very similar in terms of setting up these institutions, then sort of what is the signaling value there? If we should maybe expect empirically these kinds of institutions to look quite similar. And then Andres also made a comment about, with cross-domain deterrence, maybe some clarification, as I understood it, maybe the scope conditions of the paper, and thinking about sort of exactly what domain of deterrence, and if we expanded this, I think in some ways related to the points that Tiberiu raised earlier, sort of what's unique about this kind of deterrence versus others. So Nadiya, if you'd like to respond.
So I discussed a little bit. I don't remember if it's a footnote, or maybe it was in an earlier version of the paper. I assume that cross-domain, of course, cross-domain deterrence is very important. And Garsk and Lindsay, they have a book, and also I think they were building a game to explain that. So I'm not too sure. I definitely saw a draft maybe like 2 years ago. So I'm not too sure, at which stage this work is, but they're known to pioneer this idea, and they're working on the game. I don't remember, because it was a while ago, I don't remember like what the parameters and what they are kind of looking at with this game, but they try to explain the cross-domain deterrence logic there. So obviously, I don't want to kind of do similar, pursue similar effort. And I do think that framing it the way that Andres suggested might be very interesting, because I think it speaks to Aaron's idea that, and it's kind of a similar themes that I received when I did my interviews, was that a lot of times these institutions are built because of the alliances, trying to collect the alliance requirements or other things. I think in that regard, the important point is about the perceptions, how the adversarial nations perceive these efforts. And of course, if it's a part of the alliance group, I briefly mentioned that at the end of my paper is that the question of extended deterrence plays a huge role, and we don't know how much of the, it would be hard to distinguish empirically how much of the actual deterrence by building cyber institution by weak nations can play a role versus extended deterrence. But it's something that I need to think about. I guess one more thing that I wanted to mention is that a lot of times when you have significant cyber capabilities, you do have military capability in other domains. Of course, it's not the case for when you're a weak state. So let's say for a weak state, even if you can pretend that you have the cyber capability, if you're thinking about cross-domain deterrence, then you're much weaker in other regards. So you're not gonna, that the logic of cross-domain deterrence would work a little bit differently here. So I cannot make assumption. Basically I would need to build a different model to incorporate cross-domain option, I would say. But I think it's definitely something that I need to address either in a footnote or expand, or like have a paragraph or two to expand this in the game itself. Thank you. So Andres, are you there or are you done? I received an email from him, so.
Okay.
I think he sent me his notes, so I'm not too sure if he's trying to join or maybe he's not.
Yeah, it looks like we may be having some, it looks like he's in here, but I'm not sure. Oh, there. Oh, okay.
Okay. Sorry about that. Had to power cycle the internet.
No worries.
I emailed out the written thoughts so that Nadiya and whatnot have that intent to sort of same time, but to sort of conclude with sort of two last thoughts. The first is, it seems that there's two different ways for this paper to go. What the paper has done is sort of, there's this suboptimality in how states invest in cyber institutions given what they get out of it. One version of this paper is identifying that suboptimality in a model and just saying this is the thing that exists. There is an inefficiency in deterrence and defense. And second is a paper that's sort of explaining that suboptimality. And you start doing some of that towards the end in the sort of teaser model. There's, like you mentioned, the public, allies, threat environment, threat perception, all that I think is sort of good. I think you want to decide, do you want to sort of bury this as this is a thing for later that's interesting, is why does this inefficiency happen? Or make the paper about, here's my theory of the sources of that inefficiency. That is, are there reasons to invest in cyber institutions other than their signaling value? You mentioned a little bit in the paper about domestic politics, organizational culture, as things that an adversary considers. I was wondering if those are things that a state itself considers in their decision to create cyber institutions. And I was thinking in the conventional context, the research on sort of military branch rivalries and cases like Canada in like the 70s collapsed all of their military branches into just one armed forces. There's other cases where that's happened, or like when the Marines were birthed, that research might have sort of logics of why set up a new institution as opposed to just giving the Army, Navy, and Air Force a couple $1 million to do their own cyber things however they see fit. Sort of some thoughts or research about that could get into other reasons why you might invest in cyber as a standalone institution, which I think the budget examples you give are really interesting, as sort of examples of that. So fleshing out other reasons that might happen besides signaling.
Thank you.
So I had some brief thoughts. I thought the paper was very interesting. I'm really excited about this kind of growing interest in cyber conflict and cyber deterrence in particular. And I agree with Tiberiu. I think I think it's worth thinking through, and you do this in the paper, but I think there's even more room to do this in maybe follow-on papers, to sort of think through what makes cyber conflict unique in terms of its properties, and sort of like what we should expect for making the strategic interactions in this realm of conflict different from sort of traditional. And so in particular, what I was thinking about as I read the paper is most of my research is on alliance politics, and you engage with the alliance politics literature here, and I wonder sort of what this looks like in an extended deterrence scenario, right? So I wonder to what degree these concepts that you're using here would suggest, would sort of suggest different predictions potentially from kind of what we know about extended deterrence in a conventional warfare scenario. And in particular, it strikes me as an important difference is just that in space, just spatially, right, cyber conflict is quite different in a way that I think is probably important for thinking through extended deterrence, right? So, extended deterrence in a conventional sense requires the defending state to move resources physically, right? And it's not clear to me that that's the case here. So does that make extended deterrence easier? Or does it kind of lead to a situation where if we have this informational uncertainty about whether or not the defender is willing to help out the protege, does the fact that sort of the cost of sending a signal of support is lower, does that undermine extended deterrence? And I think, I don't know if you've thought through those things, but it strikes me that that might be an interesting way to sort of extend the logic here.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I agree, but I think I need to figure out one model before I build something else. Yeah, but I think it's very interesting. You're absolutely right. Yeah, it definitely, yeah.
A quick two-finger I have on Brad's thing, the sort of the non-kinetic nature of cyber thing that he mentioned, I think is interesting. A lot of people talk about it for, here's what makes cyber unique. Trying to think of sort of closest analogies for other sort of military capabilities where it's hard to get others to know what you're capable of without the cost, etc. Is think of like special ops is something that I don't know a lot of political science that has really dived into it, but it's similar to cyber in that it's hard to convey your special ops capabilities by just being like, here's my budget for special ops, or like, hey, look at all these Navy SEALs that I have. States kind of don't really do that, and everyone can just say like, we have a ton of sweet Navy SEALs, but until they do something, yeah, that's sort of useless. And so I think that's sort of thinking through other cases where the non-kinetic or sort of budgets don't kind of show the capability in a separating signal sense is something that cyber is the most egregious example of, but I don't know that it's alone relative to other things as much as people tend to say.
Okay, so I think we're getting pretty close to our time here. So maybe I'll collect if there's any of the discussants have any sort of last thoughts. We'll collect those, and then we'll give Nadiya a chance to respond to anything that's left hanging.
Okay, I have a suggestion. Maybe how to think about the broader project. So use this weak and strong country as a type. But I think what is interesting about deterrence here, like the notion of weak and strong is very different than the traditional conflict. So think about some country like US, which is a rich country, strong in the traditional military sense, but it could be very vulnerable given that, say, most of our life is online, or depending on, let's say, versus something like North Korea, which, the US cannot really threaten them with retaliating, bring them their, internet grid and so forth, because most of their interactions are not online. So a regime like North Korea might be, it's not cheap, but it's relatively cheaper to invest in some offensive cyber capabilities, as long as you get some computer scientists, some software and so forth. Maybe there's a small probability, but they could be quite could take a very detrimental action to the US in the cyber realm, whereas US cannot do much in retaliation because it's just they are not their interactions do not depend as much on online. They're not online as much as us, right? So here maybe there's something you can think of about what does it mean here weak and strong. Maybe some of the traditional weaknesses and strengths are reversed here, right? Or someone weak could actually become very strong here in a way. But some backward country can actually be strong in a way because it's relatively cheap to invest in these cyber offensive capabilities, right? But you are not as vulnerable as a more economically developed country. It's just a suggestion. I don't know what.
I was thinking about vulnerability and how it can play a role in this game and how I define these countries. So your suggestion would be to define weak U.S. as a weak country based on the vulnerability, and North Korea as a strong based on the vulnerability.
I'm not sure. I don't know if it's weak. It's more of the weakness is more of an effect, right? But it's more vulnerable, right?
Yeah, it seems like the downside of being attacked for the U.S. is much higher than it is for
the effect of a successful attack would be really bad. Whether there is a successful attack, that's different, right? But whereas a successful attack for North Korea, is meaningless. There's not much you can do there.
But don't you think that's the way I was thinking about the besides the exception that we have North Korea, I was thinking that the increase in capability a lot of times is, to some maybe extent, is correlated with vulnerability. Wouldn't be this the case most of the times?
It might be, but it might have some interesting cases. Right? So with North Korea, for instance, there was this example where they attacked Sony. Well, they were offended by the movie,
right.
the way they were depicting, and there's not much you can do against them in terms of sort of cyber, right? You cannot really retaliate. What could you do? You could retaliate in the traditional sense, right? So it could be where US could say, if you engage in these cyber attacks, I might just bomb you. They could do that. They could threaten along other dimension, but this will get you, into that. There was an early question about these cross domains, right? So that might be something where you really have to think, more careful about domain, because the retaliation here might not be strictly cyber. So much you can do really to North Korea in terms of cyber, but you could do a lot in the traditional, right? So that might be enough to deter them to say, well, I can bomb you and you'll be a regime change or something wrong.
Right.
Okay. But I don't know what. Again, maybe it will be important, to think about this conceptual distinction, what weak and strong would mean here, and how that might be related to the traditional weak and strong concept, and maybe whether there are some sort of interactions across deterrence domains where some of that is more vulnerable, like US, in terms of cyber attacks, should actually rely on, traditional military strength to deter the cyber attacks or traditional threats. Right? You just cannot retaliate, I think. Right.
Okay. Thank you.
I think it's a very interesting project overall, and I think it's really worth investing because it's novel, and I think we'll have a lot of payoffs down the road.
Thank you.
I agree. Aaron, Andres, any last thoughts?
Let me just quickly comment that I think that Andres' idea of focusing on the two different aspects of the paper is a pretty good one. And I think I wrote that to you in a previous note to kind of split out the things. I think that intellectually it'll allow you to focus and build the case and then really develop the model subsequently. I think that if you did that, you'd have 2 or potentially 3 robust papers or chapters in a dissertation or something like that that would lead to a more consolidated and logical outcome rather than trying to get everything done in one paper.
No, yeah. Yes, I think that's I like the suggestion a lot, but I need to think a little bit more about the What I mean is, it's a matter of when I will be able to do 3 other things. I think that's a definitely valid area to explore. You have to write the source of inefficiency and why do this kind of stuff. Is kind of I kind of try to address a little bit with my other papers in my dissertation. Not necessarily building a model. I'm doing another paper on the public opinion of this inefficiency, how they perceive it, and also looking at the how much of alliances and rival nations adopting these creating these institutions, how their actions are driving other nations to increase their cyber institutions, and then network analysis for that. So it's not necessarily, again, they are 3 different papers, but they are not necessarily, it's not a book dissertation, but you have to do the right, explaining this in the model might be, a very interesting way to go about this. It just takes a lot of time to build a good model, and I'm not very good at that. So, yeah, a lot of patience.
All right. Any last thoughts, Andres?
Last thoughts are sort of a thumbs up. I like this stuff. I think it's going in a useful direction, is worth doing. I think that you have done a good job of sort of selling it in terms of the deterrence cyber are just 2 words that people kind of lump a ton of thoughts together. But there's a difference in thinking about deterrence of cyber versus cyber as deterrence. I think that you've sort of identified that distinction nicely in the paper and justified a reason where there's utility, focusing on the latter, kind of cyber as a means of deterrence, which I think is neat and makes sense. So yeah, keep it up.
Great. All right. Well, we are out of time, so I'll give Nadiya, if you want to take just like maybe 1 minute to, if there's any kind of last responses that you want to give, and then we'll wrap it up.
No, thank you so much for you guys organizing this really important channel, and thank you for all of you for taking your time from very busy schedules. I know it's the end of the semester and it's spring, and it's hard to focus when the weather is nice outside. So thank you so much for all your feedback and taking your time on Friday to discuss this. Yeah, and hopefully you'll see a new version at some venue soon.
I look forward to it. All right, I want to I'll conclude by thanking Nadiya first and foremost for sharing this really great, exciting work. I think this is a very important topic, and the paper is very interesting. I look forward to seeing it out soon, hopefully. So I'll thank Tiberiu, Andres, Aaron for reading the paper, offering these very helpful comments. And I believe that our next OPSC will be on May the 3rd. I'm looking at the schedule correctly, and we'll have Erica De Bruin from Hamilton College presenting a paper explaining the design and implementation of Civil War peace agreements. So until then, signing off. Thank you. See you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.